At a certain point in your career, you start to ask yourself, what makes a really great picture? Is it technique? Is it the ability to draw really, really well? Is it knowing everything in the world about oil paint? It's literally none of these things. The answer to what makes a great picture is this: it's all about composition. But how do we actually learn composition? How do we get better at the one thing that is most deterministic in terms of making our artwork as great as it can possibly be? Thumbnailing. In this video, I'm going to show you how I approach this critical drawing exercise when I'm preparing to make a portrait drawing. All the clips that you're going to see in this video are taken from a very in-depth lesson on thumbnailing that I made for my Patreon students. You can follow a link in the description of this video to find it, but yeah, you already knew that. Let's get on to the lesson.
A thumbnail is a small sketch that's made relatively quickly, and it's used to help you work out and understand compositional concepts much more rapidly than you can in a larger and more detailed drawing. In this lesson, we're going to make two separate thumbnail drawings, one horizontal and one vertical. Now, on this paper, I'm going to make two boxes. They don't have to be very neat, but they do have to be the same proportion. Remember, the final drawing that I'm going to make afterwards is on one of these same A4 sheets of paper. So I want to represent that proportion here as I'm making these studies for the composition. There's a couple different ways that we can break down these rectangles to help us understand spatially where to place the model. Maybe I'll use a different one on each one of these squares. So we have something that I think comes from the world of photography, known as the rule of thirds, meaning that if you break up a rectangle into a 3x3 grid, you would come up eventually with these significant points where those grids cross. In an optimized composition, you would capitalize on these significant points and significant heights in order to frame your subject in the best possible way. Now, a lot of times, the rule of thirds is used to optimize landscape compositions. So you would have a high horizon line, maybe there's a hill that runs across it, a little house on the top, and then you'd have, a couple of figures down here that are at the bottom of the hill looking up at the house. Maybe there's a path that runs down and goes right through these significant points in our compositional marker. Now, just because you arrange things along significant points in a rule of thirds grid does not mean you have a great composition. But it does give you one way to analyze your positioning, which will probably get you one small step closer to having a better composition. Now, before I do more to this composition, I want to show you the other grid system that you can use. Now, I've separated this rectangle into 4 equal quadrants. When you place something inside that composition, what you create is a positive shape and a negative shape. The positive shape being the subject, and the negative space being the shape around that subject. Each one of these shapes has a design to it and also has a proportion to it. That design and proportion, together with what's made in the other quadrants, can create a sense of gesture in the negative shapes and also a sense of balance and harmony across all 4 quadrants. Now, I've mentioned 2 important values here, balance and harmony. And just like balance and harmony can be important to your composition, which itself is the expression of your theme, you can also use the inverse, imbalance and disharmony, to create a strong effect in your composition. Let's go back to our landscape drawing now. And I'm going to take this and without erasing, I'm actually going to start to place a figure inside of this that takes advantage of the same key points that this sketch does. Now, I've created here a strong diagonal that goes from the upper left to the bottom right, but I haven't done anything that really addresses the full length of the composition. Since the light's coming in from the upper left-hand side, I'm wondering if I create a value in the background that frames the light of the head, maybe I can get some use out of this extra width that I have while also creating a trajectory that runs across the diagonal. In fact, why don't I raise this side of it a bit and lower this side a bit? That way this value also frames the light of the face while creating a stronger diagonal to cross this diagonal. I've mentioned it before, but it merits saying again and again and again and a million times until you always remember it. When you're making a composition, look for an S-curve or look for a diagonal. These things are dynamic. They create a sense of movement, intention, motivation, will. All of the cool, fun, exciting stuff is going to come from diagonals. Of course, that's not the only kind of composition that you can make, but I personally favor it. Now, the vertical nature of this format presents me with a question. Where do I place the head inside of that height? So I think I'm going to place this model with just a little bit of distance to the top. I've got the angle of the forehead down to the chin coming down in a diagonal like this. I've got the back of the model's neck and shoulder moving down like this. I've got a pretty efficient sense of a diagonal from top left to bottom right. Now, the other cool thing that I get with this, right, because I have that model's hair flowing downward like this, is that the darkness of her hair coming from behind her chin and neck actually frames a little bit a line that runs contrary across the top of her shoulder. So I've got a long diagonal running here and here, and I'm going to cross that diagonal here. So the hair is going to wrap around the back, the shoulder is going to run also contrary, perpendicular to those other diagonals. That leaves a little space for the model to look out here. I think it creates, based on our quadrants, some pretty interesting positive and negative shapes. And similarly to what I did in the other composition, I'm not going to darken her clothing here. I just don't think it merits the attention that a lot of dark value at the bottom right-hand corner of the composition would provide. Once again, similar to what I did here, I think that framing the light of the head with a dark value in the background is usually a pretty smart move. Compositions are really all about silhouettes. Silhouettes are the meetings of two values that you see, and you should emphasize them in such a way that you can recognize the silhouettes of the drawing from across the room. This is pivotal to the idea of what a thumbnail is supposed to do. By removing all of the detail and nuance, it boils your composition down to the bare essentials of what makes it look the way that it does. And in doing so, it gives us that big impression, that across-the-room reading of your composition that should call to the viewer's attention in the first second that they see it. So here I'm seeing really strong silhouettes created between the light of the head and forehead and between the dark of the hair and the background. So far, I'm really liking how quickly this one's coming together, how dynamic it seems. I have these wonderful sort of breaking angles that utilize all of the area of the canvas that's available to me. This other composition, on the other hand, seems to have pretty large negative spaces that are drawing my attention away from the portrait of the model, which seems small in comparison to the space. So what are we going to do? Let's optimize. I think, in fact, by changing the scale of the model in this composition, we could get a lot done. So what if we took and made the model's head a lot bigger in relationship to the space that it's in? That seems like a much better composition to me already. Now that I've figured out where I want to place these heads inside these frames, and also what scale they are, I want to develop these shapes into something a little bit more accurate so that I can start to look at the portrait as it is inside both frames. Now let's analyze what's not working. We have this horizontal composition, and we have all these sort of vertical lines stuck here, imbalanced on the left-hand side of the composition. We need to re-engage with those diagonals that we looked for at the start. I'm going to get rid of the hair completely on this lower left-hand side and the shoulder so I can bring back this diagonal. Also going to lower this side of the cast shadow. So again, we get back to that original diagonal we looked for. I'm also going to bring the light that catches the neck up a little bit. So this cast shadow kind of runs across the roundness of the neck. Kind of like that as a theme. Also makes this feel a little bit lighter, not so heavy and dark. Also, I'm going to increase the contrast along the edge of the hair as it meets the face, and I'm going to decrease the contrast at the back of the head where it meets the background. So I'm going to draw attention away from this section and into this section. And I can use the background to do that at the top and literally just lighten the value down here at the bottom. This exercise, where we take the same pose and figure out how it fits into two different orientations, is just the baseline for what you have to start doing to analyze composition on this level. The reality is, the more important the project, the more you want to pull out and express, the more that you want that project to be great, the more of these you can do. You should fill pages of your sketchbooks with little non-entity sketches like this, and then you go back and reflect on them. You'll find parts that you like. In the very end, the composition that you're developing could be one bright, brilliant moment expressed in a single sketch, or it could be a Frankenstein made up of good ideas that come out of many sketches and brought together in one final piece that ultimately expresses the optimal version of what you wanted to say. While there can be many possible solutions and many optimal compositions for a portrait, eventually we have to choose one. What I like to consider the most important thing when evaluating one of my thumbnails is, how well does that thumbnail accentuate the best part of the subject? Or the part that I find most interesting, most intriguing, the one that I want to show in its greatest expression to the viewer. Now, what I liked about this pose is that the model's shoulders were turning away, her head was turning towards us, and there was this twist and compression that occurred in the shadow on the model's neck. Right away, I discovered that this one on the right showed that more clearly by having a light value inside the shadow flanked on either side by dark values. The other thing I liked as a product of that was that sense of a corkscrew turning in depth around the model, meaning that her hair started here, closest to us, extended here, back in depth behind the neck, before emerging again on the other side. I thought this was a really cool feature. I thought it created a great sense of movement and a dynamic sense of gesture inside the drawing. Now, eventually, why I couldn't do that in this one is that extending the hair on this lower left-hand side created a shape that drew attention away from the major diagonal of the composition. So in this one, I'm losing out on what I think is one of the coolest features of this, which is that corkscrew depth and the compression inside the shadow of the neck that finds itself in the middle of that corkscrew. That all of these diagonals and gestures happen to be right in the neighborhood of my #1 focal area is also an added bonus. So I get the corkscrew, I get the compression, and I get the focus on this eye that's closest to us, all inside of one composition. Here, I think the choice is a very easy one between the one on the left and the one on the right. Is this one right here.
I hope you liked this lesson on thumbnailing. If you want to check out more about this absolutely critical topic, you can follow the link in the description of this video. It will take you to my Patreon page where for just $10 a month, you can subscribe and get access to this lesson on composition, but also dozens of other super awesome, highly optimized drawing exercises.